Hey, Mr. Sailor Man. Real quick. Um, I love what you're doing. I think you're a visionary. Humanity is going to benefit from what you're doing. But I also think there's something that you might need to hear. There's something that should be on your radar. I'm sure you get a lot of information sent to you. Um, and I'm sure it takes a lot of time out of your day. So I'm going to be as quick as I can. Currently, a good question to ask is where are all the cyberpunks? Where are all the early Bitcoiners? And um, something that's interesting, I'll get to that later, but you know, Bitcoin's appealing because of you get essentially sovereignty over your money. You decrease counterparty risk, and you basically get a ledger that won't be tampered with, right? And some advice that you essentially give is never sell the Bitcoin, only borrow against the Bitcoin. And I think that's genius, right? However, I just want to mention that there's a solution to the problem I'm about to propose. If you have a version of sound money like Bitcoin, you have no real counterparty risk. But as soon as you want to borrow that Bitcoin, you now are reintroducing counterparty risk. And the cyberpunks is the sole reason that Bitcoin reached a $2 trillion market cap. So it's very important to ask, where are the cyberpunks going? Are the cyberpunks going to Bitcoin, or is there something else that they're going to? And so if you want sound money, Bitcoin's great. But there's a group of people out there who are even more Bitcoin than Bitcoin. They want sound money with no counterparty risk. You know, same Bitcoin ethos, everything's identical, but they want the ability to have sound and sovereign financing capabilities. And my voice message is about to end, but basically, this is called kaspa. I think you should look into it. It's very important. My message is about to end. I'll see if I can send you another one. So the same way that the cyberpunks are the ones who were on the ground floor to set everything up for a $2 trillion market cap, the money followed the cyberpunks. Well, where are the cyberpunks today? This is a very profitable, or at least interesting question to look into, right? Well, the cyberpunks are people who want sound money, but also, again, they don't want to touch a counterparty. And one of the features of this would be being able to have sound money and also borrow against it. So I'm not about to shill Ethereum or some other garbage, excuse my French, but some shit coin, right? But what I am going to mention is think of all of crypto as a whole. Think of crypto as an industry, right? Think of smartphones as an industry. Think of electricity. Think of transportation. How have all of these played out, right? And an idea that I want to run by you, and my message might end soon, but I think you should hear this because this is something that will impact humanity. Basically, I'm sure you know this, like market cycles, but the first of anything is never the one that engulfs the entire market, right? The first phone isn't what we use today, but the first product to dematerialize all of the issues of the previous market is the one to gobble it up. So for example, that would be the iPhone. It dematerialized the buttons and stuff, and it added a multi-touch screen with programmability, right? Well, what if we had sound money like Bitcoin, but there was a layer of programmability on it, right? And hold on, I'm not talking about any other crypto, just hear me out. What I'm trying to get at here is in every single new industry, there is always a first, and that first mover is huge, and it takes up half the market, and that would be Bitcoin. And then the rest of the market is a cheap copycat, and that's the other half of the market, and that's crypto. Every crypto is a cheap, fractured knockoff, right? We have fractured money. Well, we also have fractured crypto, right? I would also argue the same thing happened with phones, right? There were cheap, crappy phones, but then the iPhone was really the first one to streamline and dematerialize so much that it engulfed everything, right? And so the iPhone wasn't the first phone. It had the smallest network effect, right? But it's also the one that engulfed the entire market. It sat back on the sidelines, waited 15 years for phones to develop, and then it basically solved so many issues, and it added programmability to mobile computing, right? The thesis I'm trying to portray here is that Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency and it is awesome and I love it. However, the market is demanding, there's $2 trillion of capital outside of Bitcoin that is demanding programmability. But the problem with that is that Ethereum, all those other garbage coins, they're not sound money. Bitcoin is the only sound money. But the thing is, Bitcoin doesn't have any programmability. You can't, Bitcoin's a peer-to-peer protocol, but it's limited at just money. Whereas all these other cryptos are programmability with ledgers, but it's stuck at data, right? So what would be the iPhone moment of crypto? In a perfect world, we would combine sound money with programmability. Let's have the ability to have sound money and financial instruments without a counterparty, right? If you love sound money without a counterparty, you would love peer-to-peer services without a counterparty. So that way you can use that money, right? And there are so many benefits to this. And so there's a project out there called Kaspa. I'm sure it's probably on your radar, but I really think it would be a good use of time to check it out. The only people who are attracted to Kaspa are early Bitcoiners. I see so many people in there from the year 2014. I've never met a group of people who are more paranoid than Bitcoiners until I met people in Kaspa. They are the most paranoid people you will find. And there's a reason for that. It's because they are all early in on Bitcoin, and there's a lot of infrastructure risks on Bitcoin that aren't addressed. And what I preached to you was more of the forward-thinking approach to what is Kaspa, what is it kind of solving, but that's actually half the picture here. Kaspa has nothing to do with innovation. Kaspa's core focus is there's a bunch of infrastructure risks about Bitcoin, the same way that fiat had a bunch of infrastructure risks with trusted counterparties and fractional reserve banking. There's all these counterparty risks. So I'll get into that in a little bit. So what I just shared with you was mainly the forward-thinking vision of what maybe Bitcoin could be, or some positive desires for what would be nice to have on Bitcoin. And then I mentioned that, okay, Kaspa maybe is forward thinking, but let's ignore the forward thinking. Let's switch to a conservative mindset. Okay. What's the way I knew Bitcoin early on was a solid project was because it was conservative while also simultaneously being forward thinking. And what do I mean by that? And a lot of cyberpunks who were in on Bitcoin will probably agree with me. The conservative element of Bitcoin is you're de-risking. You're de-risking from fiat. You're de-risking from a central bank. You're de-risking from the ledger of money from your government. You're de-risking from just counterparty risk. You're de-risking from fractional reserve banking. I'm sure you understand that, right? You're de-risking from essentially all these pressure points of potential collapse. And so in a weird way, the people who were attracted to Bitcoin in the past, they were not in Bitcoin for the idea of, inflation hedge. They were in Bitcoin because they needed to decrease the amount of risk that they had, censorship resistant, all that stuff. So there's this utility value that is desired, okay? And I'll send another message. But yeah, thanks for hearing me out, by the way. I know I'm sending you a lot of stuff. So I mentioned Kaspa. What's the de-risk element of Kaspa? Well, I've been in Bitcoin for a while, and I'm trying to de-risk from it, right? It's a free market. There's multiple tools that exist for the job, and I need something to de-risk from Bitcoin. Fiat's not the answer. Stocks aren't the answer. Some random crap shitcoin, excuse my French again, is not the answer, right? I need sound money with a different set of risks than Bitcoin. And there's all these proof of work knockoffs of Bitcoin that are forks of Bitcoin, but they inherit all the risks. Well, what if there was sound money with a completely different set of risks? I think there's value in that. And there's also huge asymmetric upside because, well, the same way no one was de-risking from Bitcoin, or no one was really de-risking from fiat in the year like 2018. It wasn't until COVID that people realized, holy crap, we need something to de-risk from fiat. Boom, Bitcoin. Well, the same people who were thinking about those thoughts about Bitcoin, they're now thinking, well, how do we de-risk from Bitcoin? And I'm going to share those risks to you now. Okay, so what are the risks of Bitcoin? Why would someone want to de-risk from Bitcoin? Well, the same way someone would want to de-risk from fiat, it's because of infrastructure risk, right? And so what is the infrastructure risk of Bitcoin? Fortunately, it's a hell of a lot better than fiat, right? Bitcoin any day is going to be better than fiat. However, it's not risk-free. And so there's always going to be people who want to mitigate that risk. And I just happen to be one of them. And I think a version of sound money that mitigates so much risk of Bitcoin while also carrying the same ethos with a community of people who's more paranoid, I think it's a good combo. So let me get into it. Essentially, every failed money historically has scaled in layers, right? Think of gold. Gold is the base layer, and fiat at one point was literally the layer 2. And what I dislike about Bitcoin is, why are we scaling in layers, right? Wouldn't it be in a perfect world if you could snap your fingers and say, what if the layer 2 never needed to exist? What if Bitcoin was capable of not needing a layer 2? I'm sure we all would agree with that. But the reason that hasn't happened is, there's a lot of money in Bitcoin and people don't want to change it. And so that's actually a feature, but it's also a bug, right? It's a feature because it's conservative. Don't touch my money. Don't start reprogramming things. Don't add more risk than necessary. But it's also a bug because it stops innovation. And sometimes innovation is needed to onboard the entire planet. So there needs to be a playground where people can innovate and build and set up the groundwork for the, I just want to give you a heads up, Michael Saylor. Bitcoin's only like 2% of all capital assets. 98% of them is still up for grabs. Bitcoin has not won the race just yet. And it doesn't have to be this or that, but I think this is important to at least look into, and maybe your conviction grows in Bitcoin, right? But what I'm trying to get at here is, I know I'm going on a lot of tangents, but the idea is it would be nice in a perfect world if Bitcoin didn't need layers to scale. Then it doesn't have to follow in the footsteps of every failed money before it. And so basically what I'm trying to say is Bitcoin is copying something failed money has done, and Bitcoin's only 2% market share. 98% is still up for grabs, right? And so, this is a technology we're talking about here. Network effect isn't exactly the best thing. Bitcoin has the biggest network effect in crypto, but network effect doesn't guarantee anything, right? Fiat has a bigger network effect, right? I mean, and we know it's a worse technology. Well, what if there's a better technology than Bitcoin that's better sound, faster, better money with programmability? I think that's worth looking into. And it has de-risks aspects from Bitcoin. So let me continue on. I know I'm going on a tangent, but I think this is really important to hear. So I keep mentioning what's the problem with Bitcoin scaling in layers, right? Why does this matter? Who cares? Okay, Bitcoin is one of the only technologies in the world where as it grows and grows in new users, it actually loses features, right? In a perfect world, we wouldn't want this to happen to sound money. We wouldn't want the best version of sound money to, as it gets adoption, it loses its utility value. And let me explain what I mean by that. When Bitcoin had a market cap of $0, people didn't go to it for its market cap. People went to it for its utility value. And its utility value was peer-to-peer permissionless cash without the risk of a counterparty, right? And that was it. And luckily, it also followed the School of Austrian economics, and that just happened to be immensely valuable in a world with broken fiat. However, the codes never really changed. And if you onboard the entire planet right now, the network can't sustain it. That's why we have the layer 2. But the risk, what's the risk of the layer 2? If the whole planet's using the layer 2, miners are not getting revenue to secure all that capital. You need miners to not drop off. And so the current thing that's supporting Bitcoin mining rigs right now is actually has nothing to do with transaction fees. Bitcoin miners are subsidized through the block reward, right? And that block reward only has value because Bitcoin's price keeps doubling. But you have to ask yourself, can this thing really double every 4 years? And what happens when people, it stops doubling? Right? It might just slow down, but the risk is we don't want miners to drop off. As soon as miners start dropping off, the security of the network for $2 trillion of capital, the cost to attack only gets easier. So this is something that needs to be addressed. And let me give another example. The reason this matters is because Mr. Saylor, what if I ran a business idea and I'm looking for money, right? And I said, Mr. Saylor, I have a business idea. I want you to invest in my business. How's my business going to make money? Well, actually, it's not going to make money. I need government subsidies to stay in business, and that's my only source of revenue. You obviously probably wouldn't invest in that business unless there's some monopoly concept involved. But the idea is you wouldn't invest in a business that literally does not have a plan to produce income from the services that it provides. And that's actually the same situation Bitcoin is in. Bitcoin doesn't make enough money in transaction fees, but it makes enough money in the government subsidies, in the block rewards, right? And that's fine up until a certain point. It's going to become a risk. And the same way that there's fractional reserve banking risk, well, this is an upcoming risk with Bitcoin that a lot of cyberpunks are looking at, and they're like, we need something else. So that's that. Okay, so I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but what I'm trying to get across is Bitcoin's security model has worked so far, but it's not guaranteed because we need the price to 2x every 4 years. Yes, that has happened, but it's only going to get harder from here on out. Something else I just want to mention is I mentioned earlier about how Bitcoin's one of the only technologies that is losing features as it grows. So what I mean by that is Bitcoin used to be fast, the payments used to be instant, and because the code of Bitcoin really doesn't change, the narrative has had to change. And the narrative changes is because features are being dropped off. The network can't support what it used to. And there's proof of this because Bitcoin used to be peer-to-peer cash. Okay, well now it's not peer-to-peer cash. Now it's number go up technology, or it's an inflation hedge. It's an inflation hedge. Well, now as all these people are onboarding, it's, oh, no. Bitcoin is now the base layer for banking and the institutions. But notice why is it that every 3 to 4 years the narrative of Bitcoin is changing, right? The answer to the question is because the code is not changing. It's not scaling. And basically what's going to happen is this is already happening. The early cyberpunks who were in on Bitcoin earlier are already leaving it, right? This is hard to see because so many people are flooding into Bitcoin. No one's going to notice the early cyberpunks leaving. But they're leaving because they're seeing their features disappear. They were attracted to Bitcoin for one thing. They're leaving now for something else. And what are those features? Well, essentially self-custody, the ability to self-custody your Bitcoin. If Bitcoin has these massive, or I guess when it has these massive transaction fees from the price not doubling every 4 years, or even that, even if the world just tries to use the base layer, if everyone right now tried to send a Bitcoin transaction, the fees would be like $3,000. Um, that's not, and so because of that, the peer-to-peer counterparty-less money it lost a feature. It's no longer that medium of exchange. And that's fine. Everyone's looking at Bitcoin as an inflation hedge. But what happens is, okay, well, the feature maybe you don't care about left. Who cares? Who needs permissionless cash? Let's have an inflation hedge. All right, well, what I'm trying to articulate here is that's a feature I care about. Maybe the rest of the world doesn't. But that inflation hedge feature is next on the chopping block. As Bitcoin has more and more of these risks start to show because it hasn't addressed any issues for the past 15 years, that's why all of crypto exists. All of crypto exists to try to solve this, and they do a sloppy job. But Bitcoin lost the medium of exchange feature. Okay, but what else comes with that? Well, it's also the self-custody feature. Because if you do want the medium of exchange, okay, well now you have to use a Lightning channel, or you have to reintroduce counterparty risk and use a custodial solution. But let's assume you're trying to be self-sovereign and you use a Lightning channel of your own. That's technically considered a hot wallet. It's not even a cold wallet. So you're now reintroducing some risks because you're not on the base layer of Bitcoin. Bitcoin might be too expensive to operate on because the UTXO sets might be less than the transaction fees if it actually gets the adoption that we want to see. And so this is just something I think should be looked into, right? The free market is going to feel these pain points and they're going to look for solutions. They're going to do what they've always done. And humans always innovate. I guess what I'm trying to articulate here is that the narrative of Bitcoin changing is a symptom of the code not changing. The layer 2 of Bitcoin is a symptom of the code not changing. People having to use, not literally going to be priced out of self-custody. If your net worth is less than the future UTXO transaction fee value, you don't have a right to self-custody. You're priced out of owning your own money on this ledger. That day hasn't necessarily come just yet, but let's keep in mind only 2% of the world's using Bitcoin right now, or 2% of capital is allocated to Bitcoin. If everyone decided to send one transaction, the fees would be insane. What happens when 100% of the world wants to do that? Is too expensive. So self-custody is a feature that's next on the chopping block. And that might not be a problem. Most people want ETFs. Most people don't care about self-custody. Most people don't even care about inflation. So who cares, right? The cyberpunks care. The cyberpunks that created this $2 trillion asset care. Because what if we had a version of Bitcoin that didn't lose features, right? Wouldn't that be more valuable than a $2 trillion asset that does lose features, right? Isn't the value proposition a lot stronger, right? So I just think this is interesting to look into. I'm just sharing my thoughts. I hope you take some time out of your day. I think that'd be awesome. All right, so I just proposed to you earlier future innovations of what Bitcoin could look like with permissionless protocols like permissionless finance. And I also just shared with you some of my risks, my concerns about Bitcoin. But now I'm going to share what does this actually look like? The reason Bitcoin has these problems is because of how nodes operate, but also Bitcoin is a one-lane road at 10 minutes per block. So think of Bitcoin as a one-lane road and the speed limit is set at 10 miles an hour for the rest of humanity. But like humans always innovate. We're always going to have bigger cars, faster cars, better tires. We can go further. And so population is going to increase. Well, what happens when all of the globe needs to use this one road? Not only is it narrow, but it's 10 miles an hour. Well, someone needs to create a solution where there's 15 lanes, and the speed limit is 85. And more lanes can always be added, and the speed limit can be raised. Speed limit is the block time. The amount of lanes is the block size. And we can learn a lot from every crypto's failure. We can look at the pain points of Bitcoin. We can look at the pain points of Solana. It's not even decentralized. You can look at the pain points of Ethereum. You can look at the pain points, all these other cryptos, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Satoshi version, right? All these garbage projects, right? But they all were trying to solve something here. They're fractured. They're fractured Bitcoin, right? Even Bitcoin is fractured Bitcoin now. And so there needs to be a version of Bitcoin that lanes can be added, the speed limit can be raised, and nothing breaks. And this should theoretically be done on Bitcoin. You might be wondering, why isn't this done on Bitcoin, right? Why don't we just change the code if needed? If anything gets to that point, let's just change the code. Let me explain kind of why that's never going to happen. So the idea is, first of all, Bitcoin is now there's too much money in Bitcoin to start changing and messing around with the code, but let's forget about that. It's too risky. Like that's like, let's not change the code. There's $2 trillion of capital in there. I don't want my money to be messed around with, right? But on a more technical level, the reason that Bitcoin doesn't have lanes that scale and the speed limit that rises with better hardware is essentially because of how nodes function and the logic of the nodes. So nodes is the limiting factor of Bitcoin. And essentially, we need to have the nodes to be decentralized, but that also maybe limits the network. So the best solution is, well, how do we have scalable Bitcoin where the nodes can still be decentralized but not also compromise the network, right? And really what this comes down to is just look into this. How are orphan blocks handled, right? If you know why does Satoshi design 10-minute blocks, right? Why didn't he do 1 minute, right? That sounds better, right? In 10 minutes, the long story short, the reason is because of what's called orphan blocks and the risk of causing a bunch of forks. So 10 minutes isn't like some strategic genius design. It's more of a Band-Aid. He's like, fuck, like, excuse my French, but he's like, I don't know how to, 10 minutes is just it worked. It worked, right? Every first piece of software sometimes has bits in it that just put it out there. It works, like, and 10-minute block times, ideally it would be 1 minute, but so many forks would be added to the network. So that's why we have that. But why do we have 1 megabyte blocks? Well, if we have anything larger, then we risk nodes becoming too expensive to operate. So there's also the logic, though, of, well, what data is stored on the node? And a lot of the Bitcoin nodes, they store a lot of useless data. They store the UTXO set, which is very valuable. That's something we don't want to lose, right? The UTXO set is the balance of, what's on everyone's wallets. So that's necessary. But the transaction history and the logic of how it's stored, Bitcoin actually needs archival nodes. And so the whole logic of Bitcoin basically saying, hey, let's keep Bitcoin at 10 miles an hour and let's only ever let it go to one lane, even if the whole planet tries to use it. It's this fear around losing decentralization to the nodes. And kaspa fixes this because they just changed the node logic. The node logic essentially is Bitcoin has to have archival nodes. kaspa doesn't. But all the UTXO sets are always stored on both, right? But with Bitcoin, it stores transaction history and all this unnecessary data, right? Um, what's more important, your transaction history or the bank account balance, right? So transaction history can be saved on Kaspa if you want, but you can discard it. But there's also cryptographic proofs that can decrease that storage size. So everything can be proven essentially if you're running a Kaspa node, whereas a Bitcoin node, um, the transaction history is always there and it bloats the network. Anyways, my brain is getting kind of burnt out from explaining all the stuff, so my apologies. But basically, long story short, I think it might serve you well to take some time, and you'll learn more about Bitcoin nodes if you learn about Kaspa nodes. If you look at a Kaspa node and you say, why do they operate like this? Why don't they operate the way a Bitcoin node does? Just ask a bunch of questions. Why does a Bitcoin node do this? Why does a Bitcoin node store that? Why does a Kaspa node discard that? Why does a Kaspa node, why does it need this? Why does it discard that? Just kick the tires of a Kaspa node and just do, okay, well, why would they do this? What are the benefits of this? Are there any benefits? Okay, well, why doesn't Bitcoin do that? Oh, okay, well, why hasn't this happened? Like, you're a smart guy, dude. You're like a rocket scientist. So, nodes are very important. There's a lot of other stuff you can look into regarding mining, but Kaspa is also technically a harder form of money too. The emission schedule is faster, so Bitcoin will technically have inflation while Kaspa doesn't. And this is because Kaspa will be raising support for the network all through usage and transaction fees. There will be no need for block subsidies. There will be no need for that government subsidy for Bitcoin in a way. So Kaspa is going to be a form of money with less inflation, less infrastructure risk, better lightweight, efficient nodes. And because of that, it allows for the breakthrough of everything I mentioned above with the programmability aspect to the sound money. Whereas everything I just mentioned before about Bitcoin, that's why it's limited at just money. So there's a lot to this. I really think you should look into Kaspa. It's decentralized. Same Bitcoin ethos. All the questions you'll probably have about Bitcoin, you can learn about Kaspa. Use AI, bro. Just use AI, man. Or just read the actual academic papers and whatnot. But yeah, dude, good luck. I just want to thank you for your time. I know I threw a lot at you. I'm a huge fan. I've watched so many of your podcasts and whatnot. Um, so props to you for really putting Bitcoin on the map. What you've done for humanity is really incredible. So even if I'm over here articulating my concerns about Bitcoin and some of its pain points and why I'm maybe looking at Kaspa, I still think what you're doing is phenomenal. Advocating for sound money is literally a very honorable thing to do. So, keep it up, man. We need more sailors in this world. So yeah, thank you for your time and have a good rest of your day.